March 1945. In a dim barracks room in Yokohama, a German liaison officer attached to the Japanese army pressed his pencil against a hidden notebook. He had survived Iwo Jima, not as a combatant, but as an observer sent by Berlin to study Japan's defenses. What he witnessed beneath that volcanic island weighed heavier than any battle he had seen in Europe. He wrote cautiously, knowing discovery could mean disgrace or worse. His lines trembled with fear as he described the ground alive with screams, tunnels that burned like furnaces, fortifications that were in truth tombs. He confessed that he had believed himself hardened after Stalingrad, after watching cities erased by fire and steel. But Iwo Jima was different. The earth swallowed men whole, choking them in fire and darkness. As he closed his diary, he whispered that no officer could ever report the truth aloud. What they had seen inside those tunnels would not only haunt the Japanese defenders, it would haunt them too. German officers sent to Japan late in the war were meant to be symbols of solidarity between Axis powers. They were technical advisors, naval observers, men who had studied Europe's battlefields and believed they had already endured the worst humanity could produce. When they were invited to inspect the fortifications of Iwo Jima before and during the American assault, they expected to find an island fortress built with German precision. Instead, they encountered something altogether alien. The Japanese had carved the island into a subterranean city. Over 11 miles of tunnels, bunkers, and galleries cut through volcanic rock-connected gun positions, command posts, and living quarters. To the German eye, it was both brilliant and horrifying. The air was sulfurous, thick, suffocating. Temperatures inside the stone corridors soared, burning eyes and lungs even before the battle began. Yet thousands of Japanese soldiers lived, waited, and prepared to die in those caverns. The Germans were struck by the contrast to their own experience. In Europe, trenches and bunkers had been temporary shelters against artillery. On Iwo Jima, the tunnel was the strategy itself. General Kuribayashi had ordered that every inch of ground be contested, not above, but below. No glorious charges, no visible front lines, just waiting in the shadows for an enemy that would inevitably come. For men accustomed to propaganda about Japanese discipline, the reality was starker. They saw soldiers who had already accepted death, digging and sweating in the dark for the sole purpose of slowing America's advance. One German liaison later wrote that the defenders lived like ghosts before they were even dead, moving as if the island already owned them. When the first German officers stepped deeper into the defenses, they realized they were no longer on a battlefield, but inside a labyrinth designed for death. The tunnels twisted in every direction, some so narrow that only one man could crawl through, others opening into vast chambers where entire units could wait in silence. The air was foul, lanterns sputtered in the heavy atmosphere, and the walls seemed to sweat droplets of sulfur. For Germans who knew trenches and concrete bunkers, this was another world. The earth was not shelter, it was a weapon. Above ground meant nothing. Shells could fall for hours, planes could drop bombs until their fuel ran dry, and the tunnels would remain intact. Entire battalions of Japanese troops disappeared into the island itself, unseen, unfazed, waiting for the Americans to come close enough to ambush. One German observer whispered that it was as if the island itself was alive. You saw nothing, you heard nothing, and then the walls spat fire. Claustrophobia gnawed at them. Echoes made it impossible to tell how far a tunnel stretched or where it led. Sometimes air vents carried whispers from distant chambers, making it sound as though voices floated in the rock itself. No one could tell how many men hid beneath their boots. Was it 1,000? 10,000? The uncertainty rattled even the most seasoned officers. The haunting truly began when the Americans brought fire into the earth. German observers were stationed near the ridges, allowed to watch how the U.S. Marines dealt with tunnel warfare. They had expected explosives, perhaps poison gas, perhaps relentless artillery. Instead, they saw tanks fitted with nozzles, spewing fire into tunnel mouths with a roar like dragons awakening. The Germans had fought under artillery barrages that flattened cities, had watched divisions vanish in Stalingrad. But this was different. A shell killed instantly. A bomb obliterated in a flash. Fire was slower. It moved with terrifying intent, clinging to walls, sucking oxygen out of chambers, turning stone passages into ovens. They heard screams that began as human and ended in wordless shrieks before being cut short by suffocation. The flames didn't just kill, they erased. One German wrote later that they thought themselves hardened, but fire was not war. Fire was punishment. Fire was judgment. Marines did not use it sparingly. They used it systematically, marking each cave entrance, each crack in the rock, until smoke poured out like the island itself was exhaling death. What unsettled the Germans most was the routine. American crews joked with each other as they prepared fuel tanks, treating the act of incinerating men as just another task. To them, it was procedure. To the observers, it was horror turned efficient. Courage meant nothing in the face of such weapons. No oath to the emperor, no loyalty to Führer or fatherland could resist fire that flowed like liquid through the veins of the earth. When the flames subsided, German observers were led inside. They expected wreckage and bodies. What they found were tombs sealed in soot. The walls were blackened, stone blistered, steel helmets peeled like foil. Rifles fused into the hands of men who never fired them. Some caverns contained rows of bodies collapsed without a mark, suffocated before fire reached them. Their faces were frozen in silent screams, eyes wide, mouths open, expressions preserved in agony. The smell was overpowering. Flesh, sulfur, oil, and charred wood blended into a stench so thick it clung to uniforms for days. Germans who had endured Leningrad and Hamburg confessed that Iwo Jima was worse, not in scale, but in intimacy. Death here was not distant. It was close, personal, inescapable. The silence afterward was even worse. In burned caverns there was nothing, no sound, no movement, only charred shadows against the walls. Hardened soldiers could not meet each other's eyes. The Japanese had dug fortresses, but what they had built were tombs. Long after battles ended, the Germans carried away one memory above all: the smell. It was not just death. It was sulfur rising from the soil, burned oil in the rock, the sweetness of flesh consumed by fire. Even when winds rushed across the island, the odor clung like an invisible fog. One officer confessed in his diary that the stench followed him into sleep. He thought he left it behind at sea, but each night he woke choking, lungs filled again with Iwo Jima. The tunnels were never silent. Even when a section had been blasted or sealed, strange sounds drifted through vents and cracks. Faint whispers, rattling metal, soft thuds. Germans admitted later that they never knew if the noises were echoes or voices of the dead. Guards swore they saw figures flicker at the end of corridors, only to vanish into darkness. Some claimed to hear entire conversations in Japanese, though no soldiers could be found. They began to speak of ghosts, Geister, walking beneath the island. By night, the sense of haunting deepened. Even explosions meant to seal tunnels carried weight, as though the spirits of entombed defenders pressed through the stone. Hardened officers refused to enter certain shafts. calling them cursed. For the Japanese, it was duty, to fight until death and become part of the island. For the Germans, it felt unnatural, as though the earth itself had swallowed its soldiers and breathed them back as shadows. By the time American flamethrower tanks rolled forward, the Germans already knew they were watching something beyond war. Shermans spat liquid fire across hundreds of feet, flames curling into caves, slithering like serpents around corners. Engineers followed with charges to seal openings, ensuring no one could escape. The Germans had long seen tanks as the pinnacle of war. Now they saw something darker. Fire had become industrial. It was procedure, efficient, repeated until nothing remained alive. They realized then that industrial power had created not just endless shells and bombs, but endless fire. What had once been terror had become a system, refined and multiplied. Watching tunnels burn, they saw the future of warfare. And it was not courage, not strategy, but fire delivered by machines until nothing survived. When the island finally fell silent, the Germans carried away more than tactical notes. They carried memories that clung like shadows. Burned caverns, suffocated men, the smell of sulfur and flesh. One officer, back in Germany, woke choking at night, convinced the air had turned to smoke. Another trembled at the sight of a bonfire, as if the flames might slither toward him. Years later, veterans claimed a whiff of oil, a flicker of heat, or an echo in a hallway could hurl them back underground. For men hardened by campaigns across Europe, the tunnels were worse than Stalingrad, worse than the bombing of their own cities. Those battles were brutal, but still recognizable as war. Iwo Jima blurred the line between combat and extermination, between life and burial. The earth itself had become an enemy, and fire had turned every refuge into a furnace. What haunted them most was not only the horror, but the inevitability. No bravery, no oath, no sacrifice could resist America's methodical use of machines and fire. This was not war as they had known it, but industrial destruction perfected and multiplied. In their silence after returning home, in their eyes when they spoke of Iwo Jima, it was clear. They had glimpsed something that convinced even hardened soldiers that ghosts were real. The tunnels of Iwo Jima were never just stone and smoke. For those who entered them, they became a nightmare without end, a memory that followed long after the guns went quiet, haunting them forever.